Hi everyone, so there's going to be a spoiler in this video, so if you don't want to know the results of the 2026 Royal Rumble, stop listening now because I'll be mentioning that. I've just watched this year's Royal Rumble from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's not the first WWE event in Saudi Arabia, and it's not even the first Royal Rumble. It was the greatest Royal Rumble of 2018. Um, but this year's Royal Rumble was won by Roman Reigns, and a lot of big names in it. Big event. But I thought it would be a useful opportunity to talk about the issue of so-called sports washing versus the idea that Saudi Arabia is actually progressing. This is a controversial issue because in the world of sports, particularly wrestling and boxing, but I'm sure other sports as well, Saudi Arabia has really been pushing hard to become one of the centers of the sports. It's you could see it in boxing, you could see it in wrestling, and like I say, probably elsewhere. I'll go focus mostly on boxing and wrestling just because I'm more familiar with them. Um, I have very mixed views on it. Firstly, a few words about the Royal Rumble, because one of the litmus tests for this is the Women's Royal Rumble, which has been a WWE event for some years now. Not really a major issue in the West, but in a conservative Islamic country like Saudi Arabia, the very fact that there is a Women's Royal Rumble is significant. Now, I'm going to just briefly look at the claims and counterclaims. So, critics say that this push by Saudi Arabia, the so-called Vision 2030, is a way of masking its appalling human rights record. And I do think it's got an appalling human rights record. There's no point of pretending otherwise. However, supporters say that actually by opening up in this way, the human rights record will inevitably improve. I think there's some truth in both statements. So, if we go back 10 years, roughly 10 years, there was the case of Raif Badawi, the dissident, and he was a prominent atheist. Saudi Arabia is one of the most dangerous countries in the world to be an atheist. Probably even more dangerous than being a Christian or a Jew. And he was sentenced to flogging. And there was an international outcry. Eventually he got released from prison, but there was a big international outcry over that. I am not convinced that Saudi has improved much when it comes to the treatment of non-believers. It is, of course, the centre of the two holy mosques, and the King of Saudi Arabia, one of his titles is the custodian of the two holy mosques. Millions of Muslims go there every year for the Hajj pilgrimage. Saudi Arabia is a middle power. It's quite a powerful country. It's a major regional power. I think in world terms it could be fairly seen as a middle power. Not a very powerful country, not on the sort of scale certainly of the United States or China, but significant enough that other countries do pay attention to it. Of course, there's a long-running kind of regional Cold War with Iran over the religious schism in that regard. Saudi's predominantly Sunni, Iran's predominantly Shia. It's a large country. I think it ranks about 8th or 9th biggest by area in the world, something like that. And it's potentially a very rich country because of its oil reserves. And fair to say it is wealthier per head of population as well, like per capita, than other Middle Eastern countries. But again, I mentioned the WWE events. There's also been boxing, so Usyk versus Fury 1 and 2. Fury versus Ngannou, Usyk versus Joshua 1, and I'm sure there's other events. These are world heavyweight title fights, so we're not talking about kind of periphery things. They are the absolute centre of the sport. That has been very good for Saudi's PR in the sense that it's allowed them to showcase, these big sporting events. Leaving aside the human rights issue for just a second, there is practical questions. For instance, there's 25,000 people at the arena in Riyadh. the other big venue that is used is in the city of Jeddah. Um, there is a question about practicality. It's a little bit like if we draw a boxing analogy, when Muhammad Ali had his famous fights in Kinshasa and Manila, they were aired locally so that American audiences could see them at a kind of reasonable time. There is a practical question about Saudi Arabia with the time zones and so on. WWE is an American company. Most wrestlers are American. Yes, there's quite a lot of European wrestlers, quite a lot of Mexican, but most of them are American, and it's an American company. So I just wonder, from a practical point of view, how many American fans are going to fly over to Saudi. Um, I have no problem with an organisation like WWE moving around the world. They recently had the heavyweight title fight between CM Punk and Finn Balor in Belfast. And they've also had events in London and Germany. Um, it's a major sports industry, so I've no problem with it moving around the world. But I just wonder, from a practical point of view, if it's always held in Saudi Arabia, or if big sporting events are always held in Saudi Arabia, obviously it's going to be locals that benefit most from that, in the sense that they're closest. So I wonder how that will work in terms of the gate. I mean, will there be a reduction in the number of buys directly in the arena or not? I'm not sure. In the world of boxing, Wembley is a far bigger arena than most venues either in the United States or Saudi Arabia. Um, the Saudis have also really moved deeply into the world of boxing. There is a Saudi promoter, and I'll just pronounce his name correctly because it's a name that always comes up. I want to promote this correctly. Turku Al Sheikh. Yeah. He has become a very big name in the world of boxing, and on the plus side, he has definitely brought boxing to a wider audience. I mean, they now upload fights. His YouTube channel upload fights days after they've been broadcast, whereas before you'd have to rely on pay-per-view. So from a fan's perspective, I give him credit for that. Now, with this Royal Rumble, there's one thing that I think is an interesting litmus test, and that's women, the participation of women, because I mentioned the issue with atheists in Saudi Arabia. There's also the issue of women's rights. Traditionally, women have had to accompany a male guardian. Well, there have been women in the audience as spectators, quite a number of young women. The Women's Royal Rumble, there's an interesting thing. I noticed all the participants were conservatively clothed, i.e. they basically weren't revealing much. I mean, I'm not talking you could see their faces, but they were in full body attire. Now, I don't really have a problem with it, but it's indicative in and of itself of a conservative mentality, i.e. the organisers obviously were a bit either, Paul Levesque and WWE themselves were iffy about that, or the Saudis said, look, we can have this, but they need to be addressed appropriately. So you can look at it in one sense, yeah, that's very conservative and backward. On the other hand, the very fact that a women's Royal Rumble is taking place in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, this would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago. So unlike China, it may be that there's actually signs that Saudi Arabia is progressing. When China's had big sporting events like the Summer Olympics of 2008 and the Winter Olympics of 2022, the argument was, well, China will reform. And it didn't. Its human rights situation actually got worse. Qatar, there was huge controversy over the Football World Cup in Qatar in 2022. The Gulf states have a terrible human rights record, particularly with migrant labour and LGBT rights. But I actually think there is some genuine signs Saudi Arabia may be improving, albeit at a slow pace. Just the fact that there's women in the audience and the fact that female wrestlers can compete, I think in itself is indicative that there is real change happening. And, it would be one thing to say, oh, this is just for the cameras, but it is happening. It's in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I was looking at the winner, incidentally, was Liv Morgan. I was looking at the match, and there was young Saudi women, presumably Saudi women, obviously being inspired by these athletes. And they were enjoying themselves, it was a big sporting event. The figure that's often heralded as behind Saudi Arabia's reformist moves is Crown Prince Mohammed just get the name correctly here. I'm just working with multiple screens here, so bear with me. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he's often seen MBS. He's one of the most significant figures in the Middle East, and he's often seen as a reforming figure. The King of Saudi Arabia is an old man, King Salman. So really the real focus is on Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So the question is it genuine reform, or is this all just a cover, i.e. sports washing? Okay, we'll show the world this image where we're progressive, where we're showing big sporting events, but it's basically a way to deflect criticism from the human rights record. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think there is genuine reforms happening, and I think there may actually be some truth in exposure actually putting more pressure on the kingdom to reform. On the other hand, this is a country that just 3 years ago executed 81 men in a single day. Now, of course, they will say that they were terrorists and drug dealers, but a country like Saudi Arabia, I do not trust their justice system. I mean, this is not a democracy, it's a dictatorship. Paul Levesque himself said, it's a very different culture and we have to respect that. I've never really went along with that argument in any sense of the word. I don't think that cultures that disregard human rights should be respected, actually. I think the onus is on outsiders. My view is, if they want to be treated with respect, then that has to be earned as well. Saudi Arabia still has a long way to go in terms of how disbelievers are treated, in terms of dissent, in terms of internet freedom. There's still a lot of things that need to happen. However, the situation for women has genuinely improved. I'd say today, January 2026, Saudi Arabia is somewhat better than Iran for women. And we're talking here in context, right? It's clearly not Canada. It's clearly not Western Europe. But it is better than Iran. I genuinely think it's improved in that regard. Women can now drive in Saudi Arabia. There was also a thing a few years ago where there was a kind of fancy dress cosplay for Halloween. Again, this might sound like a trivial thing, but all this stuff kind of adds up and indicates maybe it is genuinely improving. So we'll leave it there. I'll be honest, I'm a bit wary of the extent to which Saudi Arabia is getting involved in sport, the Riyadh season and so on. I'm wary of it. Having said that, I don't want to be too negative. I think there has been some genuine reforms, and that has to be encouraged. Hopefully Saudi reformers will see, or Saudi Arabia in general will see, that when they make changes, when there are improvements, it creates a positive image for the kingdom. It would be wrong to say a hermit kingdom, but they barely even had tourism a decade ago. I remember when I was flying over in Emirates, now that's for the United Arab Emirates, but again, there was this kind of little propaganda video about the Emirates plan for the future and so on. Sometimes having more exposure can actually put more pressure on improving the human rights situation, because they don't want the bad PR. They don't want this sort of negative coverage. Having said that, a big mistake would be just being complacent and saying, oh well, they're improving, everything's fine. There's still a very long way to go, and Saudi Arabia still has a very bad human rights record. No one should pretend otherwise. And I don't think that big sporting events is going to change that overnight. What I do think they could do is gradually put more exposure on the kingdom, which means that if more people consider travelling there, then the authorities might think, well, we don't want bad press. So it may actually be a positive thing in the long term. I don't think that's been the case for China. Big sports events did not improve China's human rights record. Final thing I'll say to anyone who says, oh, it's their culture respected. No, human rights is universal, and I don't respect any culture more than basic human rights. You will never convince me that it's a legitimate culture to flog a man to within an inch of his life simply for his beliefs. That's barbaric, and I have no problem saying so. But if there is genuine progress going on, it has to be welcomed. Of course it has to be welcomed. I think the situation in Saudi Arabia is better today than it was 10 years ago, albeit a long way from ideal. And it's not a case of being like the West. The West doesn't have a perfect human rights record, as we've seen from the United States. But progress has to be welcomed wherever it is. And with that, some food for thought. Let me know your take on this. Do you think it is sports washing, or do you think there's genuine progress going on?